One of the things that is supposed to protect the United States from the rise of autocracy is the independence of its key institutions. The judiciary, the legal system, universities, even influencer institutions like churches and medical institutions and the arts. Unfortunately, one of the things we learn from the rise of autocracies and worse in history is that while you may get courageous individuals who stand up against tyranny, you will always get some of those individuals, institutions, more likely to comply through fear, some would say cowardice. It's easiest to point at the most extreme case studies, so whilst not necessarily equating them with what's happening in the present, we're back onto Hitler's Nazi regime, where the courts and the judges quickly fell in line, enforcing new laws against dissidents, rarely challenging the regime in anything. Academia quickly fell in line, expelling Jewish professors and leftist intellectuals. Numerous academics competed to show how enthusiastically they embraced the ideology, encouraging their students to take part in book burnings. Medical institutions, the arts sector, the Protestant Church most actively, but also the Catholic Church through silence. And they did all of this because of the fear of repression, the fear that career advancement would be impossible without compliance, as well as those who, of course, initially supported the policies in themselves. So if you're trying to measure the state of things in your country, there's an important indicator there. Now, the United States is slightly more complicated because it is a deeply polarised political sphere, both sides of which have embraced certain extremes in the last decade. Declarations of counterintuitive belief that must be accorded with or else you risk losing your job and your reputation. So when it comes to, for instance, the cowardice of the academic institutions, we'd already seen this in relation to cancel culture and what is now called wokeism. We'd already seen a variety of academics telling the pollsters they dared not speak their mind openly for fear of being hounded out of their jobs. And that was bad. Plenty of videos on this channel from when that was at its height talking about how bad that was. But that was then. Now we are into the other extreme. And the challenge at this point is that pressure is being brought to bear on a variety of institutions and primarily by the government itself in order to remove or silence opposition to its actions. So one was one side of a culture war. What we're seeing now is more of a traditional power play. The main element in common is the cowardice of many of the people and the institutions who you might have thought were paid to push back on this sort of thing. So many stories by journalists now are currently testifying to the fear gripping their sources who consequently insist on anonymity. So fired federal workers asking not to be quoted by name because of how they're being demonised as a group in the MAGA news and social media streams, and they don't want to be singled out by name. University presidents are keeping quiet, shelving their DEI programs and whatever else they think might make them a target, noting how Columbia has just been brought to heel by the withdrawal of federal funding. Chief executives worried about tariffs and other repercussions and hence keeping quiet, and the people who are supposed to be engaged in all of this. So, for instance, the Republican lawmakers who are paid to have an opinion, they have either muzzled themselves or dramatically and suddenly flipped their positions, because they've been told if they don't, Elon Musk will fund their primary opponents and have them ousted. Stephen Levitsky, professor at Harvard and author of the book How Democracies Die, put the obvious into words. When you see important societal actors, be it university presidents, media outlets, chief executives, mayors, governors, changing their behaviour in order to avoid the wrath of the government, that's a sign we've crossed the line into some form of authoritarianism. The most insidious and direct threat, of course, would be of physical violence. Now, the administration does not, unlike established fascist regimes, use a de facto state militia to terrorise its enemies. Let's be thankful for that much. But the undirected actions of true believers can start to have some of the same effects. What the administration has been doing is pulling security details from former establishment figures who require protection as a result of their public service work, making them feel a little nervous. The likes of General Mark Milley, former Joint Chief Staff Chairman. The New York Times, in a piece on this topic a few weeks ago, said, quote, one prominent first-term critic of Mr. Trump said that not only would he not comment on the record, he did not want to be mentioned in this article at all. Every time his name appears in public, he said, the threats against him from the far right increase. In the same piece, they talked about speaking to one business leader who said something that I've said here myself in my video on Elon Musk, that chief executives see the way that Musk is going about slashing the federal workforce as totally crazy. But this business leader only told them that on condition of anonymity, because he too feared retribution. Some are finding the weight of the law directly aimed at them. So a number of law firms, for instance, that have carried out work on legal cases where they were opposite side to Trump, as of course they're legally entitled to do, indeed as someone has to do in order for the legal service to work. They have been directly targeted. So, for instance, the law firms Perkins Coie, Covington and Burling, and Paul Weiss, each had been the target of separate executive orders signed by President Trump, stripping their lawyers of security clearances, access to government buildings and officials, and so on, basically making it next to impossible for them to do work for the government at any level. Perkins Coie issued a statement saying that the executive order targeting them was patently unlawful and hence it intended to challenge it. Last week, further to that, a federal judge barred the order from going into effect on the grounds that it would likely be found to be illegal. But others have caved, and they've caved presumably because the harm they would likely suffer can't in itself be prevented by such an order. So the firm Paul Weiss crawled to the Oval Office to capitulate, and the next day President Trump announced that they had agreed to pledge $40 million worth of pro bono legal services to issues favoured by the president. Plus, it had committed to stop using DEI policies, and it had acknowledged that a former partner of the firm who had pushed for Trump to be charged criminally had in some way unspecified committed wrongdoing. Here's the thing. Paul Weiss had lots of corporate clients for huge ticket items, giving it over $2.5 billion in revenue last year. Companies like ExxonMobil and Apollo Global Management, who would be highly likely to defend their own interests by pulling their business from legal firms being targeted in such a direct way by the president. This was why so many institutions and companies caved to cancel culture those years ago, because very quickly the big corporate clients, those that were public facing anyway, came under pressure and they threatened to pull their business unless the problem was resolved. Money talks, as always. It's just that what used to be a Twitter storm of activists is now the focused malicious intent of the President of the United States. Then there's the judges. Now it's worth noting that there is a real problem with the justice system in the United States. Some legitimate criticisms of how the system works. First of all, it has political appointees to roles that most of the rest of the world consider to be best kept apolitical, how most of those countries work. But also, presidents on both sides have had district judges who slap nationwide injunctions on policy initiatives from the executive. So for background, there are around 700 federal district court judges divided between 94 geographical districts. And it's obviously not an ideal system where you might get a judge in California or Texas or Arkansas or wherever whose rulings will affect policy across the entire country. That happened 6 times to George W. Bush, 12 times to Barack Obama, 14 times to Joe Biden. But Donald Trump makes those look puny. He had 64 in his first term, more than a dozen so far in the first 2 months of his second. And yes, in all of those past cases, the judges involved tended to be ones that were appointed by the opposing party to the president's party. Because, of course, people seeking to resist a proposal, they will go to the legal jurisdiction most likely to render a favourable verdict to their cause. Now, it may very well be the case that issue will get resolved soon when the birthright citizenship case is considered by the Supreme Court. But in any case, while there may be an inbuilt issue, the resolution of that issue should not involve intimidation and dismantling any scrutiny of legality of the administration's actions. Obviously. Particularly because this administration has shown every sign of seeking to push the parameters of executive power by simply testing the law to destruction in all directions all at once. So yes, if you do that, you will end up in court more often and you will lose more often, even if you don't lose all the time. But that's not how it's playing out. Instead, a process of intimidation is underway. For example, Judge James Boasberg, a judge who was appointed by George W. Bush originally and who ruled recently that the administration could not send 261 migrants to a prison in El Salvador, not without some kind of due process. The administration continued the deportation flights regardless, giving some bullshit non-arguments about how they hadn't done this in deliberate defiance. An argument somewhat undermined when President Trump then started fuming in public that Judge Boasberg was a troublemaker and an agitator and a radical left lunatic who should be impeached. A Republican House member duly filed articles of impeachment hours later. Like a good boy, and Elon Musk said that he'd made the biggest campaign contribution allowable to several House members who supported those articles. Trump told Fox News, "We have rogue judges that are destroying our country. Ah, the enemy of the people." This has then turned into a marked uptick in threats of violence against judges. There are reports of an increase in personal threats. Some of Trump's supporters have published biographical details about judges and about the children of those judges. Judge John Kavanaugh, who blocked the Trump birthright citizenship order, judged by most people to be patently unconstitutional, was the subject of a bomb threat hoax. The New York Times reported that a number of unordered pizzas were delivered to the homes of numerous federal judges who had been involved in disputes, all arriving at the same time. The message, it said, was simply, "We know where you live." And what about the Supreme Court? With a significant majority of conservative judges, a number of them Trump appointed, they would be above this sort of thing, wouldn't they? Chief Justice Roberts has pushed back against threatened impeachments, saying these are not the appropriate way to deal with judicial disagreements. No pushback against him so far that I've heard about. But there is no blanket defence. Justice Amy Coney Barrett, a Trump appointee, of course, came under a barrage of MAGA criticism after she voted alongside the Chief Justice, as well as the Liberal-appointed Supreme Court justices, to block Trump's move to freeze foreign aid. Those simultaneously arriving pizzas I mentioned, some of those arrived at households of relatives of Amy Coney Barrett. So far, the justice system has not been quick to cave to pressure. Possibly because the threats have still been relatively restrained, threats not actions. Also, House Republicans don't have the votes to impeach federal judges, so those calls are really for the benefit of the base, more than they are a realistic project. Some House Republicans are looking at how they could bring a bill that would do something. For example, the No Rogue Rulings bill that would aim to crack down on the ability of lower court judges to block measures with injunctions. This is one of the areas where you might well just see, though, how transgressive this movement is prepared to be or not. Because the language being used is pretty uncompromising. For instance, Trump ally Mike Davis saying activist judges, particularly in DC, think that they are the Trump resistance, the Trump political resistance. What they are doing is lawless and dangerous, and it must be stopped. It's how the movement deals with things they describe in those absolutist terms, for which there are no convenient legal levers at their disposal, at least not ones that will yield quick results. That's likely to be the canary in the coal mine. The media and social media platforms are also in the frame, but they are significantly further back in the queue because they can't block, they can only talk about and challenge. Now, Trump has, of course, penalised in a mildish way organisations like the Associated Press for failing to comply with his demand that the Gulf of Mexico be called only the Gulf of America, regardless of the fact that the AP has an international audience, many of whom have not changed the name, and besides which, free speech, eh? And we have seen some preemptive cowardice, of course, with Jeff Bezos specifying that the opinion pages of the Washington Post will be oligarch-friendly only from now on, and reorganising the newsroom accordingly as well, having already killed a previously proposed editorial endorsement of Kamala Harris during the last election. In his other business, Amazon, Bezos also has made a documentary series about Trump's wife Melania, with a reported $27 million payment going straight to her. A deal that was described by one insider as, quote, ridiculous, but pragmatic. Trump had previously been highly dismissive of Bezos, but consistently acknowledges when people have become compliant, so he was praising him recently. Jeff Bezos is trying to do a real job with the Washington Post, he said approvingly. But right now, there is still a free press in the United States. Right now, there is still an independent judiciary in the US, and they seem a very long way from going away. The mechanic that people fear of intimidation and pressure, and ultimately, if things got worse, actual violence, leading to a culture where the institutions all fall in line, nobody ever speaks out, nobody ever pushes back, that is not the situation. We are, of course, only 2 months in, so it's not obvious that conclusion is necessarily the win that it sounds on first hearing.